Hello and welcome to the Political History of the United States. Episode 4.59, Dark Days. I think that when we look at the Revolution as a whole, we can go ahead and mark 1780 as the lowest point of the entire war for the United States. 1775 had seen the war begin and had featured moments like Lexington and Bunker Hill. Although the latter was a loss, it was the exact kind of loss that the Americans would have taken pretty much every single time. 1776 saw some devastating losses, such as in New York, but it also saw the Declaration of Independence, and Washington really did rally to close out the year. 1777 saw the American victory at Saratoga. 1778 saw the American alliance with France, and what we can go ahead and call a victory at Monmouth. 1779 had been something of a down year, but it is not as though the British scored any huge wins either. Finally, as we are going to see in the near future, in 1781 the Americans are going to wrap the year up with a victory at Yorktown, marking the effective end of the war. 1780 was different, though. It was a year that saw loss after loss. The American Southern Army had been destroyed not once, but twice. Between the fall of Charleston and then the subsequent loss at Camden, there was hardly anything to celebrate. Add to this the rapid fall from grace of Horatio Gates, as well as the betrayal of Benedict Arnold. And, well, it was a pretty awful year for the Americans. This week, I want to march through all of these events and examine just how the country managed to keep it all together, as everything seemed to be going so terribly wrong. Before we can just jump in and see how everybody was reacting to 1780, I want to first begin by catching up with George Washington. The commander was in a sour mood heading into 1780. While he was frustrated by a lack of action, he was even more concerned about his army, which was desperately undersupplied. Washington worried that his army may not be able to defend its position in Morristown should the British attempt to launch a raid. He likewise worried about the Americans' ability to hold West Point. He worried that if the Americans lost West Point, their hold on the Hudson may slip away, and again New England would be at risk of being isolated from the rest of the country. The British were likewise acutely aware of the importance of West Point, and had begun courting Benedict Arnold by this point to hand over the keys to the location without a fight. Arnold, as we already know, was receptive to the idea. But then, in the spring of 1780, Washington's spirits suddenly perked up. That May he learned that the French had an army on the way to the United States. It had been a while since the Americans had really seen much out of the French. Now, it's not as though they were skipping out on the fight. Rather, their involvement in the war was largely taking place outside of North America. The French Navy had indeed spent a significant amount of time down to the south, where they were busy fighting the British in the Caribbean. Likewise, back during 1779, recall that the French had showed up off the coast of Savannah, just in time to join in on a decisive loss to the British forces that were holed up inside of the city. For his trouble, D'Estaing was seriously wounded. Other than that, though, the Americans were left wanting. Washington was itching for an offensive and was tired of sitting around twiddling his thumbs. Now, though, he had information that the French were on their way with 6 ships of the line and some 6,000 troops in tow. Well, there probably was a pretty good argument that those troops should have been moved to the south. By this point, Washington developed something of a preoccupation with the recapture of New York. The French army coming to America was also under new management. The overall command of French forces was now under the command of the Comte de Rochambeau, with the Chevalier de Charny in command of the naval forces, replacing D'Estaing following his injuries suffered the previous year in Savannah. It is worth mentioning that Charny will not feature heavily in our story, considering that he would die shortly after arriving up in Newport. News of the French return was not exactly a surprise to anybody, having been reported in Tory newspapers. It was actually through the press that Washington himself would learn of the approaching army. Now, Lafayette had been sent ahead with the news. himself returning to America as well, having spent some time back in France following the abortive Battle of Newport. However, Lafayette seems to have gotten caught up visiting with some friends in Boston, meaning that Washington learned of the approaching army from the Loyalist papers. We also know that by early June, Henry Clinton himself was aware of the incoming French. Recall that after he issued those proclamations that had so infuriated the Loyalists and its leniency, while its overly burdensome requirements for paroled Americans to join the Loyalists had pushed many of them right back into fighting for the American cause, Clinton quickly packed up and left for New York. In this instance, Clinton was reading the tea leaves, and was well aware that Washington's eyes were likely gazing north. Unfortunately, the promise of the French arrival was really the highlight of the year for Washington. Even before the French had arrived, Washington and his generals had agreed that the best plan for an assault on New York was going to be a siege. This would be possible theoretically with the naval assistance that France was bringing across the Atlantic. Although some, chiefly Lafayette, supported a direct assault on Manhattan, Washington was not a fan of plunging headlong into a well-defended British position. The Americans had already seen firsthand what such entrenchments meant for the approaching army. With the decision now made, Washington sent Lafayette to let Rochambeau know the plan. Rochambeau was not a fan. Sure, the French had said that they would defer to the American commander, but the French also aren't going to set up their army to be annihilated either. Rochambeau responded to the plan by stating that there were not enough men, insufficient naval supplies, and a supply chain that was, if we are being polite, a dumpster fire. Not wanting to totally shut down his American counterpart, Rochambeau agreed to give his conditional approval to a siege, predicated upon the French getting sufficient reinforcements from France, naval reinforcements from the Indies, and Washington himself raising more men. To the final of these points, it is also worth pointing out that Rochambeau himself was hesitant to count the militia as men that you could count on. He was well aware of their performance in the war, and knew that at the first sign of a problem, they were more likely to melt away than stay and fight. Furthermore, there was little hope that the siege would be complete by the end of the year, meaning that expiring enlistments meant that a large percentage of the manpower from the Americans could literally walk off of the job on New Year's Day. Rochambeau also decided that he should be talking directly with Washington, and in a sign of political deftness, agreed to a mid-September conference in Hartford. Throughout the summer, Washington busily worked on trying to get the troops he needed to satisfy the French. This was going poorly. Washington struggled to get even half of the men that he knew that he needed for an offensive against New York, and was beginning to seriously worry that if the French knew just how bad the situation was, that Washington barely had enough food to feed the men that he had, they would decide that this was a pointless venture and abandon the Americans altogether. None of this would actually end up mattering, however. By the end of August, Washington had learned that French reinforcements had been held up by the British, and that they would not make it to America before the end of the year. The siege was off. The French having to cancel the battle was certainly a blow to Washington. He was desperate to get his army back into the field. Also keep in mind that as he is making plans for this, we are hanging out right before the American loss at Camden. Prior to learning about the outcome of Camden, Washington had to have had at least some concern about what a dramatic victory by Gates would mean for his own prospects. Washington was clearly aware that he was not going to raise the necessary men, and that should Gates score a huge victory, his position may become uncomfortably tenuous. Even if he did raise all of the men necessary, the questions of how to arm them and feed them was something that he had not quite figured out yet. The French being the ones to say that the proposed siege was not going to happen meant that Washington was shielded from the French finding out just how dire his situation really was. The meeting in mid-September still took place as planned, and by all accounts Rochambeau liked Washington. For his part, Washington encouraged the French to keep that siege of New York in mind, but at a minimum said that the troops should be moved to the south of the city to prevent Clinton from being able to reinforce Cornwallis in the south. He also presented two alternatives, including a joint attack on the south or a sojourn into Canada. Although Rochambeau did not totally shoot down the idea of an eventual siege, he made clear that it was not going to happen in 1780. As far as the other proposals by Washington, the French rejected it on account of not having sufficient naval forces. Disappointed to be sure, Washington left Hartford frustrated that another year was going to pass and the war was not going to be brought to a close. Before returning to camp, Washington decided that he was going to pay a visit to West Point and ensure the defenses were well maintained. As we have talked about previously, Washington fully believed that West Point was key to maintaining control over the Hudson and keeping New England from being isolated from the rest of the country. Thankfully for Washington, he had one of his most capable commanders overseeing West Point, Benedict Arnold. Now that we have dashed George Washington's dreams of a 1780 assault on New York, I want to spend the rest of our time today moving through these events and looking at the reaction to all of these things. If 1780 was the low point in the war for the United States, I want to see just how the states managed to get through the obviously bad times. One of the defining traits of the American Revolution that we have been talking about throughout this entire season was the power and influence of the American press. More than just reporting the news, the papers had proven to be a critical part of the revolution in their ability to paint a narrative. Think back to the field day that the press had in 1777, when, that June, John Burgoyne had made his grandiose statements of unleashing an Indian menace on the population. The press blew the quote up and made sure that everybody saw it because it struck at such a core fear of the American population. How could you possibly support the British when they were willing to sink to that level? Just months later, it was the death of Jay McCrae that became a national story, which showed the brutality of the British and their Indian allies. By 1780, though, we see a changing dynamic as the American press begins to struggle to paint that rich narrative that they had just a few years earlier. So the question becomes why? What had changed, and what did those changes mean? The practicalities of war had meant that throughout 1779 and following into 1780, there was almost a near-complete collapse of the American press south of Virginia. We have already talked in some previous episodes about how violent the war throughout the South was. Rather than just being contained to those big battles, ones like we see in Savannah, Charleston, or Camden, there were hundreds of small local skirmishes that would largely come to define the war in the Carolinas. In a war that saw neighbors openly attacking neighbors, a breakdown of those previously critical communication networks occurred. The fall of Charleston made the situation in the South so much worse. In a world of already dwindling American presses, especially in the South, the capture of the largest city in the American South all but silenced the news coming from the most active region of the war. In one anecdote, we learn that the news of the American loss in Camden was being reported in Paris before it reached the desk of the Virginia governor, Thomas Jefferson. These pressures from the ongoing war meant that information from the South became nearly inaccessible outside of the South. For Americans living up in the North, they had very little idea of what was going on in the Carolinas. Such a lack of information led, inevitably, to confusion and often inaccurate reporting. That is, when stories were being reported at all. Although the collapse of the communication networks through the South played a significant role in the declining reporting on the war in the South, that alone fails to fully tell the story. Part of the problem is that the situation in the South was so bad that it became nearly impossible to add spin to the reports to make them fit a narrative that moved the cause forward. In Georgia, nothing had gone well. They had lost important leaders, like Casimir Pulaski, They had suffered a high number of casualties. At the end of the day, what did they have to show for their sacrifice? Absolutely nothing. Now, this is not to try to say that the press did not at least try to paint a picture. Following the American loss in the 1779 Siege of Savannah, the press turned to a favorite topic of theirs, the arming of slaves. Ever since Dunmore had made his proclamation back in 1775 regarding offering emancipation to defecting slaves, a common theme used to whip people up against the British was to appeal to that base fear of a slave rebellion. We have talked, literally for years now, about how that fear of slave uprisings had kept many sleeping with one eye open. It was enough of a fear that when John Lawrence suggested freeing some 3,000 slaves in exchange for enlistment in the Continental Army, he was pretty much laughed out of the room. Arm the slaves, you say? Yeah, we are not going to be doing that. The reporting from the fall of Savannah focused on justifying the loss by explaining that it had been caused by the freed slaves within the state. These slaves had been armed and were responsible for the British holding off the Franco-American forces. This article would become the most reprinted of the entire campaign in Georgia, making it into 11 different papers. The article touched on all of those themes that we have talked about before, and made statements about the British using some 2,000 former slaves against the Americans. In reality, the number was far, far less, with only about 200 actually fighting during the siege. Throughout 1780, most of the news from the war was coming not from the South, but rather from the northern states. If that seems counterintuitive to you, since, well, the war is being fought in the South, while the northern theater remained relatively quiet, you are not wrong. That previously discussed collapse of the American presses in the South meant that information from the Southern theater simply was not making its way north. When the news did make it north, it was overwhelmingly negative. Losses at Charleston and later Camden did nothing to help the cause and did not offer opportunities for those few still operating presses to write anything resembling a useful narrative. In one incident in late May, near the small town of Waxhaw, South Carolina, a British cavalry detachment caught up with a few hundred retreating Americans. The fact that the British won the battle was not really the story. What was the story is that, per the reports from the scene, as the Americans attempted to surrender, British cavalry commander Banastre Tarleton sent his men forward to cut down as many of the Americans as he could. This is supported by some pretty disproportionate casualty numbers. Of the roughly 400 American troops present, well over half were dead or wounded by the end of the brief battle. This is compared to less than 20 British casualties. Well, this was clearly a stinging loss for the Americans. The more telling thing here is the failure of the papers to report on what became known in the South as Tarleton's Quarter. The loss at Waxhaw was not the largest American defeat of 1780 either in terms of men lost, nor in strategic importance. However, in a war where so much effort had gone into painting a narrative, it is curious that news of Tarleton's actions remained mostly confined to the South. In fact, only 3 papers ever would pick up the story. Although the collapsing communication networks between the states should get some of the blame, historian Robert Parkinson writes that the failure to report on Tarleton's Quarter was equally based on the largely contrived narrative of slave insurrections and Indians being brought into the hostilities. Parkinson explains that so much energy of the press by this point was being spent on tapping into those fears of slave and Indian uprisings that even a battle like Waxhaw was largely an ignored incident. Okay, so let's see what we have so far. We have a commanding general who was pretty much hamstrung from equipment shortages to meaningfully act. A French ally who seemed awfully reluctant to help said general out in his mission. A war in the South that had seen 2 devastating losses and the complete collapse of the Southern Army. The hero of Saratoga, Horatio Gates, was off somewhere looking for reinforcements, leaving his army behind. Not that news of any of this was actually getting into the hands of the Northern readers, because all of those critical communication networks had all but completely collapsed. As the war churned on, very little reliable information escaped from the Carolinas, leaving everybody partially in the darkness about what was going on in the predominant theater of the war. There is little doubt that these conditions would have just about anybody feeling pretty down about the war. However, this still fails to fully capture the misery that was pervasive throughout the United States in 1780. No, for the people to be this down, it was going to take something more. As is so often the case, that something more that would so seriously endanger the entire revolution was the American economy sitting on the precipice of a complete collapse. The economic problems were not new, and had indeed been present since the earliest days of the war. Back in episode 4.50, we talked about the food riots that had moved throughout the country in 1777. More than just incidents of violence where food supplies were outright seized, the high cost of food led to debates over the coexistence of a war for liberty and the introduction of price controls. The real underlying fear during this time is that the high price of goods might make that offer of peace from the Carlisle Commission sound mighty tempting. All of this was going on back in 1777 and 1778, and by 1780, the situation had become untenable. The primary problem is that by 1780, continental currency was depreciating to the point of being virtually worthless. By that March, the currency had become devalued to the point of being worth just 1/40th of the original value. This was especially problematic for the soldiers, who saw their pay evaporating into the ether. Everybody recognized the very real dangers that a disgruntled army posed, and the easiest way to disgruntle an army is by sapping their pay. With inflation running mostly unchecked, finger-pointing became the order of the day. Most of those fingers found themselves pointing in the direction of greedy merchants, who were partaking in the age-old tradition of war profiteering. The general allegations being thrown out is that the shortages were deliberate in an effort to drive prices ever higher and take advantage of a desperate population. In Philadelphia, price controls were put into place to try and right the ship. This, however, just had the opposite effect, as farmers quickly figured out that they could just sell to the surrounding towns whose populations were equally as desperate without those pesky price controls. With few other options available, the Philadelphia Committee was forced to admit defeat and drop the price controls altogether. This move would absolutely enrage the local militia. Fed up over just about everything, they decided that it was time to vent some of their frustrations. The local militia went out and rounded up everybody that they could find, who they deemed that, at some point, had done them wrong. Their offenses ranged from ignoring the price controls, aiding the British, or just generally not getting with the program. This reached a fever pitch when, on October 4th, 1779, a small battle broke out at the home of James Wilson, an attorney who had represented many of those in Philadelphia who had been accused of aiding the British. After a brief gun battle, 7 men and a child were now dead. At the end of the day, the Pennsylvania government realized just how precarious and dangerous the situation had become. Rather than seeking punitive action against the rioters, the state government mostly gave in to the malicious demands. Pardons were issued, a massive distribution of flour was made, and the wealthy were hit with a large financial penalty if they chose not to join the fight. Congress attempted to put a band-aid on the currency issue by issuing a new interest-bearing bill at a far more deliberate pace. However, the cycle of depreciation at this point was so advanced that the new currency found itself rapidly losing its value as well. Okay, so yeah, rapidly depreciating currency, well, that is a pretty bad thing. However, as though to kick the Americans while they were down, we now have to turn to the weather. The winter of 1779 and 1780 was cold. Like, really cold. Like, I have seen it speculated that the winter of 1779-1780 may well have been the harshest winter in the nation's history. Today, the winter at Valley Forge, has become synonymous with misery and suffering. And while it certainly was not an easy winter, many of the horror stories of that particular winter actually took place a few years later in 1780 with the American army at Morristown. So, what did this literally perfect storm mean? It meant that at a time when currency was experiencing a period of catastrophic devaluation, supply shortages would hit their peak, aided by a poor 1778 harvest and a crippling winter just to round everything out. The 1780s, therefore, would ring in their arrival with a period of hyperinflation. With continental money now virtually worthless and critical supplies in short order, basic items suddenly saw their prices soar. What was the solution of Congress, you ask? Well, they just went ahead and pumped more money into the economy, which, unsurprisingly, solved absolutely nothing. Not that there was really anything that the Congress could have meaningfully done. They lacked the power to tax, meaning that they could not really raise the necessary revenue to start pulling currency out of circulation, hence stabilizing the worst of the inflation. It was not until the end of 1779 that Congress decided to stop outright pumping money into the economy, which was far too late to stop anything. The economic problems were pervasive throughout the entire country and were not isolated to any single region. On May 25, 1780, in Connecticut, 2 regiments, fed up with everything, decided to mutiny. The situation was quickly brought back under control through the use of promises, but it was impossible to ignore the significance of the event. The army was mad and cracks were visibly showing. For Washington, the entire incident was deeply concerning. He wrote to Joseph Reed, the governor of Pennsylvania, that the entire situation left him almost ceasing to hope, as he vented his frustration with a growing sense of indifference and insensibility amongst the population. Somewhat ironically, as Washington was venting to Reed about a population that had become indifferent to the cause, it was Reed's wife, Esther, who was busy spearheading one of the most impressive fundraising campaigns of the entire war. Although the plan was originally to deliver money directly to the troops, Washington himself proved skittish towards the idea, and in time the idea morphed into providing more than 2,000 shirts to the army. The fundraising effort would, in short order, expand to the other states, and stands as an example of one of the most ambitious fundraising campaigns during the entire Revolution. Considering the misery that swept through the country in 1780, it might seem apropos that the cherry on the cake would be the treason of one of the leading generals of the United States. We talked about Arnold's duplicity back in episode 4.56. However, at the end of an awful year, it was yet another blow to American morale. Now, as we have already talked about the treason, and recently, I'm not going to spend time here again going over the details of what happened. What I do want to talk about, however, is the initial reactions to the treason. If there was any sense that Arnold might receive even the slightest bit of sympathy from a nation that knew of his sacrifices for the cause, it would quickly become apparent that there was none of that to be found. The press did what they could to spin the story. It was explained that this was actually a good thing, because the capture of West Point would have been an absolute catastrophe. However, Providence had intervened and had kept West Point in American hands. The press also liked to point out that literally the only thing that Arnold successfully handed over to the British was himself. Thomas Paine attempted to argue that the plot by Arnold illustrated just how desperate the British had become. The war was clearly going so poorly for the British that they were forced to turn to desperate measures. Throughout the press, Arnold was universally vilified, often being lumped in with what Americans perceived to be their biggest nightmares. This means that Arnold was frequently compared to slaves and Indians. The American press had spent years denouncing both the Indians and the African Americans, both free and enslaved, as being British proxies in the war, handling the heavy lifting for the British and committing atrocities against the innocent Americans. Following the discovery of his treason, nobody hesitated from including Arnold amongst these much-hated groups. As an interesting twist, Washington would make the most out of Arnold's defection to show Congress exactly the consequences of shortchanging the officers. Congress, realizing that others may decide that Arnold's plan had something to it, voted to extend the officers' pensions from half pay for 7 years following the end of the war to a lifetime pension. Although it should be mentioned here that the, albeit somewhat forced, gratitude of the Congress only extended to the officers. For the common soldiers, they were granted no such lifetime pension. Arnold's treason marks something of a low point for the Americans in 1780. It is worth asking the question of, if 1780 was the lowest point of the Revolution, and Arnold's defection was the lowest point for the Americans in that year, whether or not it was the lowest point in the war as a whole for the Americans. Although I think there could be some debate here, the takeaway from all of this is realizing just how bleak everything must have seemed heading towards the beginning of 1781. Next time, after suffering through a prolonged period of misery, the Americans will begin the process of dusting themselves off and regrouping. The war was not over. No matter how the British might have been feeling, they were anything but invincible. Starting with our next episode, the Americans will begin the process of getting back down to business. Until then, I hope you all have a wonderful 2 weeks. I hope that you are staying healthy and that you are staying safe. And I will see you back here next time as the Americans appoint a new Southern commander.